Well, it was bound to happen, but the Goblin Slayer anime has finally arrived. For those of you that have been following my channel, it might be because of one of my more popular videos where I talk about the Goblin Slayer light novel. So this video is going to be a little different than my normal stuff. We're going to take a look at the first episode of Goblin Slayer and how it compares to the light novel and manga, and also get caught up on where the franchise is right now. Since then, I have tried to keep up with the light novel and the manga, to varying degrees of success, if I'm being honest, because the manga is just stuff that I read before. Which is cool to see something like the Beholder fight finally drawn, but isn't really a priority for me to keep up with. As for the light novels, I am now only one volume behind. So while I'm still one volume behind on the light novels, I can say that I wasn't the biggest fan of Volume 3. I thought that the romance elements just didn't really work so well because you know that Priestess is the only one with a chance here. Like, come on. So it really didn't interest me that much. There's some nice stuff in it. I can't say skip it because some stuff in Volume 4 references it, but in the long run, it might not be the most important novel in the series. Volume 4, on the other hand, has been a pleasant surprise from Volume 3. It is a short story collection, but it's a pretty good collection of short stories. Surprisingly, some of the stories that don't even focus on Goblin Slayer actually turn out to be pretty good, and it fleshes out the characters and setting more than you could typically do in your average Goblin Slayer story. Am I going to keep up with the series? Yeah, sure, at least till the next volume. And then if Volume 5 maintains my interest, I'll keep going with it from there. I can definitely say though, out of the 4 Goblin Slayer novels that I have read, Volume 2 seems to be the strongest. And with that being said, let's look at the newest part of the Goblin Slayer series, the first episode of the Goblin Slayer anime. Now, I have been looking forward to this anime probably ever since I first read Goblin Slayer, and that's due in part to the fact that Goblin Slayer just has a fantastic opening chapter. It's a chapter that's specifically introduced to trick its audience, and it sells you so well on the premise of Goblin Slayer that this first chapter alone is probably the reason why we have an anime in the first place. Everything you need to know about Goblin Slayer is right here in this first chapter, and he is not even the main part of it. Now, the animation is done by Studio White Fox, who previously did Steins Gate and Re:Zero. I didn't watch Re:Zero because I thought it was a throwaway seasonal anime that people would stop talking about as soon as it stopped airing, and I was right. But Steins Gate has been one of my favorite science fiction anime, and generally their track record for animation quality has been pretty consistent, and I'm happy to say that here in Goblin Slayer, it's no exception. The 2D animation is done very well, but there was some CG that showed up in a few weird places, like Priestess's staff, or some of the background goblins, and even Goblin Slayer himself at times is CGI. But it was integrated with the 2D very well, and something like Goblin Slayer's armor, which doesn't have too many organic shapes in it, can get away with being CGI. Typically, the CG goblins were regulated into the background, and I was fine with that too. I can say that I noticed the CGI. I can't say that it ever took me out of the episode. It certainly wasn't like the Berserk anime I was afraid it was going to be. Now for the music, we can't judge the opening and ending yet, because there is no opening and ending for this first episode. Unless, of course, that's the ending music, but I kind of doubt it. I was actually genuinely surprised that they didn't have either an opening or an ending. At the very least, I thought that the opening would play at the end of the episode. So either this means that isn't done yet, or they're saving the opening and ending for when we actually have our full cast of characters. And I'm willing to bet it's the latter because animation-wise, everything else looks completely finished. But the soundtrack itself sounds like songs lifted from the Doom remake and then just shoved into scenes where Goblin Slayer is killing goblins. And I'm okay with that. I am perfectly fine with this. In fact, I was kind of afraid that this was just going to have a stock fantasy soundtrack, but this fits the tone much better. Now for the voice actors. There's only 2 characters that we really care about here for episode 1, and that's Goblin Slayer and Priestess. Goblin Slayer is voiced by Yuichiro Umehara, who was Goro in Darling in the Franxx. I really didn't feel too strongly about the voice acting for Goro in Darling in the Franxx. He was fine in that. Here in Goblin Slayer though, he has a much deeper voice. The voice isn't exactly what I imagine Goblin Slayer sounding like, but it works, and I'll probably get used to it. Alongside Goblin Slayer, we have Priestess, played by Yui Ogura, and to be honest, the only thing that I knew her from was Pop Team Epic, which I don't think counts as knowing somebody for their voice acting. And for a role that requires her to be a scared, pissless anime girl, it was done pretty well. There's really no complaints. But now for what we all want to know. How is Goblin Slayer as an adaptation? As somebody that has read both the manga and light novel, it is absolutely faithful. As I said, both the manga and the light novel have the same fantastic introduction chapter, and I was a bit worried that the anime was going to combine maybe the first story and the second story and try to shove them together, but no. It does the right thing, and it makes that first chapter the whole first episode, which is exactly the way to go. Now, for what everybody's really asking for, how dark and how censored is this first episode? And let me just say this, if this is censored, then we can only imagine what the Blu-ray is going to be like. The novels have never been too specific with the description of goblin rape, while the manga as a visual medium was much more explicit about those. And, going by the first episode, it seems like the anime is going to be closer to the manga than the light novel. There's a couple shady areas, a couple darker areas of the screen, and I feel like when we get a Blu-ray we're going to see a lot more, but we're not talking JoJo levels of having a giant shadow cover the screen for about 30 seconds. And ignoring any minimal censorship that they had, there is no implication of what's going on. You know that this is goblin rape. Feels good to live in a world where this is a thing that exists in animation that isn't a porno now. But the last scene that I want to talk about is actually the very end, when Goblin Slayer kills all the goblin children, because this is the only time during the episode that the animation became stylized. And I'd be excited to see other scenes adapted with this same sort of technique. The first episode feels like a pilot OVA. If we never had any other episodes of Goblin Slayer, this single episode would still stand on its own perfectly fine. So this makes the anime completely accessible to people that have not read the light novel or manga. And if you're interested in the premise of Goblin Slayer, there's really no wrong way to get into Goblin Slayer right now. I'll be keeping up with the anime and we'll see if it maintains its quality. But right now, this was a solid first episode. But that will about do it for this video. If you guys have seen the first episode of Goblin Slayer yet, let's talk about it. Where are my gobbos at? Slayer bros. I don't know. I don't think this group has a name yet, and I don't want to put a name to a fandom because that is usually a sign that the fandom has gone to shit. And like I was planning on doing with Kamen Rider ZO, I'll make a video either when it ends or when something in the show happens that I feel warrants a video. Other than that, stick around because this October we are going full force. It's time for some more seasonal Japanophile J-horror. And this time we'll be looking at one of the biggest horror icons in Japanese movies. So until then, I don't really have a sign-off thing that I usually say. Hit those buttons.